Hi. So in week 10 we're going to be looking at going where your users are, and this should be probably a relatively quick lecture because I think looking at the case studies that you're going to see this week are much more give you a much better sense of what this looks like in practice than I could possibly explain to you. So, looking back to week 2, we looked at a lot of trends in faculty and student usage of the library. Um, and we saw lots of people are not visiting the library anymore. They might be using the library's online resources, but they're not necessarily coming into the building. Students are not necessarily thinking of visiting the library website for research first. They might still use the library website, but it's not their first stop. And in one of the studies, and I can't remember which one, it talked about how students are more likely to use like ask whatever, Yahoo Answers, stuff like that, those sort of ask sites on the web, they're much more likely to use those than they are actually to ask for help from a librarian at their institution. Kind of depressing. And at most libraries, not my own, but at many, reference desk statistics are decreasing. Fewer students are coming to the desk. I mean, actually, I think well, no, we're actually not seeing a decrease in our reference desk usage, but we're seeing a huge increase in virtual reference. So many more students are using us virtually and getting help that way. So on lots of campuses, the library is not the only place students can go to study. On my campus, that's not actually the case because there are very few. We're a commuter campus um, in a very urban location. So we are pretty much the only game in town when it comes to study spaces. There are little nooks and crannies here and there, but we're the most popular space on campus for studying. But at a lot of institutions, they've built really great student campus centers. Some places have even built like information commons type spaces without actually involving the library. There are lots of places on campus where students can study and do their work. So in cases like that, we're not necessarily going to be the place that they'll be when they're doing their research. So back in the 60s and 70s, there was a trend towards branch libraries located in departments. Um, and there were, you'd have like a geology library in the geology building and stuff like that. But with the budget cuts of the past 2 decades, librarians have gone back to a more centralized structure, and lots of those departmental libraries have been closed. And yet, the idea of going where your users are is kind of an outgrowth of this branch library model. Though in the age of the internet, when students access so much of our collection online, we don't necessarily need our physical collection to be co-located with departments. We more need our librarians to be co-located with departments. And there's lots of different ways that this can happen, and you'll see some of these in the case studies. You can embed yourself and be available in departmental offices, if that makes sense. Departmental lounges, let's say, like at my institution, in the anthropology department has a little area with like couches and chairs and stuff right when you go inside the office area. And that might be a good place to be available to students and faculty to answer their research questions when they're there. Um, there may be other areas that make sense within a department. Student center buildings, so, rec centers or student centers, any sort of place where a lot of students congregate. Could also even be computer labs, maybe. Places where students congregate and do research would be a great place for librarians to make themselves available to provide research support. We could also co-locate ourselves with other student support services like the tutoring center, student advising, the writing center. A lot of times we talk about bringing those services into the library, but we don't talk very much about bringing ourselves to them. And I have a colleague who is actually doing office hours. She's the liaison to the intensive English language program and they have a help desk, she's doing a few hours each week at their help desk, which is a great idea. We could be in student housing if it makes sense, if there's a place for us to be, like in a lounge or something where a lot of students are, where at times when we could possibly be helpful. I mean, not many librarians want to be in a student lounge at midnight waiting for students to ask questions, and that probably is the most common time for students to be working on their papers, unfortunately. So lots of different places where we could embed ourselves. And there are a lot of ways that librarians have embedded themselves that you'll see in the case studies this week. You could be fully embedded where your office is in that space. You do not have an office in the library. You are considered pretty much a part of that department or that unit. Your office is there. Those are your colleagues, the people in that group. And that's just where you are, and that's where people find you. And obviously that's great because you are located in the place where your constituents frequent. Fabulous. There are other cases where you're mostly embedded. Maybe you have an office in the department, but you're only there on certain days and times, and you also have an office in the library. So, you kind of straddle both sides of the fence in that case. Most commonly, librarians may provide office hours, so maybe they'll be located in the education department lounge, 5 hours a week, these dates and times. So just like faculty offer office hours, we can also offer the same thing and in the same area where the departmental faculty are offering office hours. Or we can do sort of a roving model where we come periodically and maybe not at specific times, maybe just come periodically when it works with our schedules to provide services in spaces that students frequent. So lots of pros of this approach. It makes you much more available to your patrons where they are. It puts a real human face on the library because the library is going outside of the library walls. You have a person there who represents a department or a specific part of a specific group. And it can be really valuable for making the library seem much more approachable. It reaches students better at their points of need, assuming that students only have needs when they're physically at the library is kind of crazy, though obviously most libraries these days are also offering virtual reference, so students can pretty much get us wherever they are, but having a physical person there, I think, can make the library seem much more approachable necessarily than saying, oh, you can text a librarian or chat with a librarian, because they don't see that there's a person associated with that. Yeah, a lot of people who may not have made the effort to contact a librarian might do it just because you happen to be right there when they're thinking of something. I know, sometimes I wouldn't necessarily ask a salesman for help, but if they happen to be right where I am when I have a certain need, I'm much more likely to ask them than if I have to seek them out. It's great that it makes you more visible to your faculty, and you'll see in some of the case studies that being more visible to faculty led to some really great collaborations. If you're spending less time on the reference desk, it gives you more time for subject-specific outreach. So if you're a liaison librarian, this can be a really positive thing because you can really spend more time reaching out to your departments. But there are obviously some significant negatives to sort of a going where your users are, roving reference, departmental office approach. And the biggest one is it can make thin staffing thinner. At a small library, it takes librarians away from the library's own service desks. So it might mean that you're more available to some students while less available to others who are actually explicitly using the library. And, in some places where the library isn't such a go-to place anymore, that might make perfect sense. But in other cases, like at my institution, taking more people off the desk when we're actually seeing an increase in people coming to the desk makes absolutely no sense. Sometimes being going where your users are just doesn't have the return on investment. If you're getting like if you're sitting in a student center or in a departmental office for 3 hours a day and you're getting like two questions, is it really worth the amount of time you're spending? Um, it doesn't, you obviously have to find a high traffic area. If there isn't a logical place for you to be that's high traffic, you're there's really no point in doing it because the students aren't going to just stumble upon you, or not many will. Um, if you have an office in another department, the con of that may be that it isolates you from the library. So you may not be as invested and aware of what's going on. You may be left out of decision-making processes. So, while it gets you closer to your department, it might distance you from your to the library. So pros and cons, and it's like everything we've talked about this term, whether you should do it or not is the answer is it depends. It really depends on the specific situation that you're in, and whether the pros really outweigh the cons. And it's always it's certainly worth trying in most cases. I won't say always, but it's certainly worth trying and seeing if it's worth offering office hours in a department. You try it for a few terms, see how it works, make sure you market it adequately, because I've seen too many times where people say, "Oh, I'm just going to offer office hours. I'm just going to be there." And they don't market it, and then nobody comes and they say, "Oh, well, there was no point in doing that." Make sure you adequately market it when you're trying it. But the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to waste some time, and the best thing that's going to happen is you're going to help a lot of students and faculty and build better connections. So it's often worth trying. So before you go into doing something like this, think about, is there a space for you that makes sense, that's high traffic, that's always going to be available to you at the times that you're going to be there? Also think about how being more available to your faculty and students might be helpful. If you're a librarian that they already think to contact and make appointments with, you may not need to do this. If they already know they can go to your office in the library, you may not need to be where your users are. And also, can your library spare you? Will your doing this mean that somebody else is going to have to cover the desk, or that you won't be able to provide as many desk hours? That's really important to consider. So how many questions did you get in that space versus at the reference desk? And it might be okay that you get fewer questions at the place where you're embedded versus the reference desk. That may not be the end of the world. It may be fine. It just depends on what your situation is. You're really going to have to look at, compare how many individual consultations maybe you had, how many students you normally worked with in your subject area versus how many you work with now. Does this lead to other useful collaborations? Is it politically valuable and being more visible to promote other things, not just being available to students and faculty, but is it helping you do more teaching? Is it helping you integrate information literacy into the curriculum? There may be other benefits that kind of go beyond the obvious. All right, well, I hope you enjoy looking at the readings this week. I think there's some interesting success stories and not so successful stories that will give you some good food for thought.